Continuing our discussion of environmental laws, I consider these more for applicable to non-living resources, so the abiotic resources. And, we understand that marine resources include the structural components, the quality of water. I mean, it's abiotic, but the amount of dissolved oxygen is very dependent on how much life it could support. And also, as we discussed, there is a degradation of dissolved oxygen, a chemical oxygen demand, or a biological oxygen demand, especially increased in areas where there's coastal development. And that was the whole idea of urbanization of the coast. And besides habitat loss, you also have a degradation of water quality, more runoff. So these laws encompass both the biological effect of filling or removing coastal wetlands, salt marshes, mangroves, and the chemical discharge from municipal waste or poor sewage treatment. So the laws in the United States are applicable everywhere, and then each state has their own, I would call them sub-laws, I'm not sure that's a good term, but each state has its own Clean Water Act and Wetlands Protection Act, and there's each states have their own Endangered Species Act, as I discussed. But sticking with the federal laws, these are the ones that are applicable to marine resource management. And you could take a full semester course just to review all of what I'm going to go over, and I'm going to do it in under an hour, I assume. So this is a lot of material, but you'll see some of the highlighted points I want you to know. But at the very least, know what acts are applicable besides the Endangered Species Act, Essential Fish Habitat, and Marine Mammal Protection Act. We'll go through these acts. And the Clean Water Act is always just called the Clean Water Act. That's a huge controlling act in the country. Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act is long. You always see a little shorthand. And Coastal Zone Management Act, CZMA, there's a whole semester course that everyone that is a senior in MSSEP anyway, but anybody can certainly take the class in Coastal Zone Management. There's also the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which has a lot to do, especially these days, in managing salmon, as we were just talking about, salmon needing, or anadromous fish in general needing to be connected to the ocean. The Clean Air Act, that issue on shipping, sulfur dioxides, clean diesel fuel, all that has come about, all that's driven by the Clean Air Act. And there's another one we deal with, Farmland Protection Act. And specifically around our area, the farmlands we're talking about are cranberry bogs. And I just want to point out a couple interesting conflicts with the Farmland Protection Act and restoring the environment. The Clean Water Act. In particular, the Clean Water Act manages the placement of fill in the waters of the U.S. That comes out of the Act. So fill, and we can kind of figure what fill is. Fill is anything from the wind turbines, if they were within offshore, if they were in federal waters, or our pilings, those green pilings from our floating docks are fill in waters of the U.S. Obviously, beach nourishment is filled. The disposal of dredge material is fill. And any coastal development that bulldozes mangroves and puts in a resort, a beach, a casino, that's fill in waters of the U.S. So then the question is, what are waters of the United States? For our purposes, let's not define that. Within the last 5 years, there have been the Rapanos decision, it's called, you don't have to know about that. But there's been Supreme Court determination on what are or are not waters of the United States. So let's just figure any water that we're dealing with will be waters of the United States. Because if not, in all of New England, if it wasn't waters of the United States, there would be a state law very similar. Most, if not all laws, most, not everyone, has a preamble. In this preamble, and if you've already taken coastal zone management, I'm going to apologize right now because I am going over 4 or 5 concepts in this lecture that we go over in much more detail in coastal zone management. Now, but we are touching on laws, so I do have to at least give everybody a baseline in this course. So the preamble to the Clean Water Act says it is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the waters of the United States. Chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the waters of the United States. Now we assume chemical and physical, of course. You can't fill in waters of the United States. You can't, change the chemical quality of water. You'll see there's national water quality standards. But the biological is something people forget about. EPA is the primary agency in charge of the Clean Water Act, and they actually have that biological authority. And people say, no, it's NOAA, or it's not U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or a state division of marine resource. No, the EPA has an authority right here to maintain or restore or maintain the biological integrity of the nation's waters. And that gives them the authority to spend money to do that. And it's restore and maintain the biological integrity. And really, some of the programs we're working on were funded by EPA, the Stormwater Management Program. During the summer we're out and we're mapping eelgrass. Eelgrass is a biological feature. That money, that funding does come through EPA to the states. So it's pretty obvious that it's a very important law. And they set the standards and they fund states and local municipalities to comply. Know this is the Clean Water Act, but it was, there are various, it started as the Federal Water Pollution Control Act in 48, Public Law 8840. So in 72, there's a lot of big amendments, and the important one we'll talk about is the Discharge of Fill Amendment. But it was, it's had various names through the years. We'll just call it the Clean Water Act. There's a lot of different sections of the Clean Water Act. What we're going to do is just look at these 4 sections 102B, section 401, 402, and 404. And there's actually Dr. Vale's lectures do go into detail with Clean Water Act compliance, especially in regards to Superfund, especially in regard to hazardous waste and waste assimilation. But also, if any of you are doing shipboard environmental compliance, you could take the Clean Water Act and you could generalize that around the world, that these types of compliance are typical for just about any nation. So you might as well understand how the logic works. Very short, section 102 requires reservoirs. So we showed you pictures of the Bonneville power plant, the Chief John Joseph's big 250-foot high dam. So there are big dams, and you may not realize it, in New England there are 35 flood control dams. They just hold back waters during a storm. There's huge water supply reservoirs in every state. The Quabbin Reservoir is huge, and that also holds back water for water supply. So these large reservoirs, or theoretically any small reservoir in a town even that used to be a mill reservoir, are required by law to provide adequate flow downstream at all times. Adequate. Now, obviously, during drought, you're going to provide less flow than during a storm event, some smart people, smart operators of public facilities manage inflow as just about equal to outflow. If you want to fill it up slowly. If you want to discharge it slowly, just above what should be natural. But if you're a power plant, you need to fill it up as much as you can when there's water coming down, and then release it within the demand of the water power, the power needs, which is usually during the day. They don't store, there's no storage of electricity here. So this act requires, especially power plants, that when things are low and things are slow, when it's summer and there's a drought, they still have to release water, even though they might want to store it and sort of augment their bottom line, the dollar. They are required by Section 102 of the Clean Water Act to provide stream flows. Section 401 is a very interesting section of the Clean Water Act. Federal sovereign immunity is waived. What that means is the U.S. Senate approved a waiver of federal sovereign immunity. The Senate approved in the law and went to the president. Obviously, the House had to draft the law, but that states can control what the federal government does under this section of the Clean Water Act for impacting waters of the state. So waters of the state, remember, go out 3 miles, and go up to the top of the mountain, we assume. So waters of the state, if you're going to fill them or discharge or augment or even temporarily or permanently, you must get a state water quality certificate. Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. Some states are Department of Natural Resources, but each state gets money from EPA. Each state has a program to issue a water quality certificate. Massachusetts Maritime Academy required a certificate, a water quality certificate, to place the pilings for the floating docks. If Massachusetts Maritime Academy dredges, and let's say we want to give the sand to Sandwich, the disposal of that sand onto the beach requires a water quality certificate. So that's a pretty strong authority. And every one of you walking out of here with a degree will be able to get hired by Mass DEP or any state and participate in issuing these permits, because you have to have some knowledge of the environment. You have to have some knowledge of projects and wharfs and docks and piers and dredging. So the water quality certificate program in Massachusetts, well, Mass DEP has about 180 people in that department, but I believe that program is over 50 people right now. It's statewide. I mean, anything you do, a river, look at some of our bigger rivers. So federal sovereign immunity is waived. So Navy needs a permit. Army Corps itself, we would need a permit. If BOEM is issuing a permit for a wind turbine. Now, the thing with BOEM is they usually don't get involved unless it's out in the ocean. So this is why the wind turbine people said, okay, we're going to build beyond the 3-mile limit, thinking there would be less permitting. But when BOEM issues a permit for the turbine, those power cables coming ashore, the power cables are fill, and it's temporary. It's permanent fill, but they basically dredge or jet the cable in and then rebury it. So that's considered filling in waters of the state. So a state water quality certificate is needed, even though most of the activity, the turbines, are offshore. Section 402, this one, as I said, Dr. Vail goes into a lot of detail. NPDES, NPDES, that's the short term, is NPDES, National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. So 402 reduces the contaminants that are being put into the ocean. Obviously, a lot of industrial processes need water. You go back to most factories were built using hydropower to run the mills, whether it was a grist mill. Then it was a textile factory. The mill weaves were needed, so the water was water power. And once you started dyeing textiles, or maybe you started manufacturing something else, or chrome plating bumpers, you realize it'd be good to be near the river because then all your waste could be washed right out into the river, and that's a good thing. So that was the norm, right through World War I and II. And oceans and rivers and harbors were just considered waste assimilation. And it was really nice to be in an urban area or in the downstream of a series of factories, meat rendering plants. Yeah, they would just kind of wash the oils off after they butchered the animals. They'd wash it off and go down the drain, and who knows where it went. I was in New Haven, Connecticut, and they had this very, very disgusting smell at low tide in the inner harbor. And of course, they wanted the inner harbor area to be improved. And Don Rhodes was at Yale, and he was a geologist, so we were asked to go out sample. And Don was going to try to figure out what was going wrong with that smell. Come to find out, it was a compound called cadaverine. It was remnants from the meat plant. It was a meat packing plant that had a storm drain that went into the West River that wound up in the harbor, and it really was just an accumulation of dead material that the entire lower intertidal flat was filled with it. So just by regulating that under 402, it changed the quality of water in New Haven Harbor. So that was decades after this act was implemented. In 1899, there was a discharge authority given to the Army Corps, the Water Resources Development Act of 1899, Rivers and Harbor Act of 1899, sorry. And it actually came out of Philadelphia. They used to render, that means kill, butcher, cattle, and certainly they need a lot of that, Philadelphia, feed people. So cattle would be barged in the area, and then the carcasses that were left over, and even horse rendering was a popular thing then, but all the carcasses and waste were simply dumped into Schuylkill River. Now that's the river in Philadelphia. It's not far from where Rocky ran up and on the Museum of Art steps. So the Schuylkill, once or twice a year, would get stuck with dead animal carcasses, trees, debris, and it was really a disgusting issue. And the Army had to be brought in several times to use dynamite to blow up this backlodge, this clog in the Schuylkill River. So the federal government said, wait a minute, we have another problem, is that some people were building sort of bridges or they're building marinas way out into the river and waterway. So they said, wait a minute, now that instead of, now barges are coming downstream, they'd have to go right, go left, and go around a pier someone would build. So the federal government gave the Army Corps of Engineers authority in 1899, and the Corps had been building a lot of things along the coast anyway. They gave them authority to regulate any discharge, any structures in waters of the United States. So it's structure, pilings, piers, and then when the Clean Water Act came along, it was any discharge was given to EPA. And that's why originally the offshore wind turbines, the only person giving a permit was the Army Corps, because those pilings were structures in waters of the United States. Since then, they actually, the Corps, we actually went, I was involved, we went down to the White House Council of Environmental Quality and said, wait a minute, we're going to we'll give a permit to do this, but we don't have the right, the Army Corps doesn't have authority to rent the bottom of the ocean. That's usually Department of Interior rents for they rent it for oil rigs, they rent it for cow grazing, they rent public property, the Department of Interior. So that's why BOEM now has that authority. And one other thing that in the last 15 years, that if you have a construction site over 1 acre, you have to get what's considered a 402 point source. And so that construction in the back of our property, they were pretty close, on the ball fields. Because if you look, it has to be, it's the whole footprint of storage and construction. So just about anything you do along the coast now needs a Clean Water Act permit. And the 402 is basically erosion control, hay bales. You have a construction site, you dig up the ground, you still have all kinds of equipment and dirt piles and stockpile. You want to make sure when it rains, all that doesn't wind up in the local receiving water body. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act is the federal permit activity of the Clean Water Act. And there's a lot of laws, techniques, there's a lot of court cases on what you can and cannot fill in the coast or in federal waters. So now if we want to go ahead and get outside state territory and put up a oil rig and put a casino on that, you're outside state territory, you could be outside of any authority of the state, you are putting fill in federal waters, therefore you have to get a permit. And the permit is from the Army Corps of Engineers. So obviously that's why the offshore wind turbines have been going to the Army Corps to get the permits, and then you sign a lease with BOEM, Bureau of Energy Management. If you work for the Army Corps, and let's say everybody that does everything at Cape Cod Canal, you have to get a permit you don't get a permit if you work at the Army Corps Cape Cod Canal. The Army Corps itself can do this same evaluation. It's a lot of what my staff did. But most of the activity under the Clean Water Act is called the regulatory program of the Army Corps of Engineers. Now there's 80 people in Concord, Mass. that does this. They're always looking for people to do that. Every one of you that comes out of Mass Maritime Academy will have skills they would want. It's not a bad career. And it's the same as the Clean Water Act 401 authority at the state level. So you have a whole cluster of jobs in the community that's dealing with basically, it impacts to marine resources, and you're trying to manage that. There's a lot of controversies on this. The marina that's been around for a while, every 5 years dredges, and the Army Corps dredges Chatham Harbor every other year. And eelgrass always tends to move into the area, so there's mitigation issues. And if you want to put a dock in your own backyard, and you're going to impact even a small amount of wetlands, you have to mitigate. And a lot of states are, well, we want you to mitigate 3 to 1. Is that fair? Well, there's a whole area of science, applied marine ecology, that makes those decisions. There are guidelines for fill, and also if you are going to fill, if you're going to dredge and then dispose, there are guidelines for disposal sites. Now there's a disposal site in state waters in Wellfleet, it's called the Wellfleet disposal site. But a lot of people in Cape Cod Bay, and even us, we would take the material and try to dispose of it or fill near a beach. So these are the references, 40 CFRs, 40 Code of Federal Regulations. So, and I do not test you. The only number I'd ask you to know is that 401 is the water quality certificate. 404 is the federal permit under the Clean Water Act. And remember, 40 CFR is EPA has the authority. Military is 30 CFR. You don't have to remember that, I'm just saying. So just remember 401 is the water quality certificate, the state water quality certificate under the Clean Water Act. 404 is the federal permit. An interesting legal requirement is that you have to sequentially avoid, minimize, and then compensate for significant adverse impacts to special aquatic sites. Now, that means coral reefs, wetlands, mangroves, all those marine resources we were talking about. In the United States, you can't just go in and rip up the mangrove marshes and build yourself a shrimp farm, because if you do, you have to compensate. Compensate costs money. You would have to build another mangrove, and it just costs a lot of money. We've talked about restoration of wetlands, restoration of fishery. Restoring things costs a lot of money. We know that. So if you're going to build a shrimp farm and you have this expense of restoring the mangroves in the United States by this law, you're going to have to think twice about it. You can't even afford to do it, let alone, how much does that make your shrimp? So it is a sequential avoidance, minimize, then compensate. And the easiest sequential avoidance is we're not going to do it when, let's say we want to avoid impacts to shellfish spawning or cod spawning. And we know exactly when they spawn. So you avoid the impact. Let's say we're going to bring cable offshore from a wind turbine, and cod spawn, and you have to go through a cod cobble bed where they would spawn and the juveniles would stay. So when that happens, avoid it by doing it during the time of year that would be not be as significant an impact. Minimizing is just the classic. Walmart wants to, build a mall. The mall has a 10 acre parking lot, and 2 acres are wetlands. They want a permit to do that, or mangroves, or whatever it is. And to minimize it, you say, no, build a 5 acre parking lot 2 levels high or 3 levels high, and you can minimize the impact to the wetlands. So there is the sort of the practicality. You need people that can delve into the permit and say, how can we protect the wetlands? Handout D would be something we would bring in the field. I'll keep that in mind. If we get out in the field, it'd be just an exercise I'd have you do. So for now, please ignore that. Oh, and 2 things. One, if you're doing a fill in waters of the United States, you now know that if you're doing a 404, getting a 404 permit, you need to get a water quality certificate, 401. So you're going to be told you're not going to get the 404 till you have the 401 in hand. So all things start locally. Actually, it starts in Massachusetts at the Conservation Commission. Then they'll say, all right, now you're good enough to eat some simple activities. The Conservation Commission could give you the 401 water quality certificate. But for the most part, you do the Conservation Commission, then go to Mass DEP, then you would go to the federal government. It's kind of linear. And the federal government under 404 would say, all right, where's your Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act compliance, Endangered Species Act compliance, and by the way, Essential Fish Habitat compliance. So the issuance of a permit is always networked on all these other laws and regulations. And it was kind of on that last slide, and I forgot to mention it. The federal activity, and there's a parallel in the state, is covered by the National Environmental Policy Act. And that act says you take all your compliances, you take everything you're doing, you put it in one document. We call them environmental impact statements. I'm sure you've heard of them. Or maybe it's an environmental assessment if it's not that significant. And that document has a process for public involvement. We won't get into all that, but that and the water quality certificate means the federal government takes an action that is fully disclosed to the locals. So if Navy's doing something, Coast Guard's doing something, NOAA's doing something, it's fully disclosed to the local. A small Coast Guard base, they do a lot of these. Their environmental compliance and Coast Guard is in Warwick, Rhode Island for most of southern New England. And they hire civilians. It's actually if you're interested in this stuff, another good place to work. It is possible to get around the Clean Water Act, and Congress is the only way you could do it. Um, but the policy of the federal government, the Army Corps, in issuing a permit is that you get the state water quality certificate. So if you want to fight everybody and go around everybody and go to Congress and ask them to exempt you from these permits if you're, a big company wanting to do something, build something, you can. It does not happen very often. Matter of fact, it is only very, very rare that that has happened. The Clean Water Act and also the National Environmental Policy, they have this concept of least environmentally damaging practical alternative. And there's another one is called environmentally preferred plan. So you'll hear that. And when you see big lawsuits, you need to pay attention to the discussion of either of these concepts. Least environmentally damaging practical alternative is the one for this. And just, they're doing the studies for new bridges over Cape Cod Canal. And both these terms have been in the Cape Cod Time. This is a real thing. And there's, at least environmentally damaging practical alternative. Uh, it's tough because it may cost a lot of more money. So you say, wait a minute, we could avoid these impacts by, I don't know, making a sky bridge or something. And then you have to get the word practicable down. Practical says engineeringly feasible, taking into account cost. So, and what does that mean? I don't know. The federal government spends millions on bridges. Can we spend 100 million? Yeah. Can we spend 2 or 3 billion on the bridges? Maybe. The Central Artery Third Harbor Tunnel going out to Logan, the Ted Williams Tunnel was 14 billion. Yeah, Apollo space mission was 4 billion. All of them, 4 billion. 4 billion. So it's a lot of money. So these are the laws that you'll see bandied about when big projects come around. But even our small projects here at Mass Maritime campus, just our peers, require compliance with the Clean Water Act. Avoid, minimize, compensate, and pick the least environmentally damaging practical alternative called the LEDPA. Now, there is an overlap. As you know, federal waters go out 12 miles. State waters go out 3 miles. So right now, the agreement nationally, and this is agreement with the EPA and honestly they're and NOAA and the Corps and all the federal agencies. If you're going to do beach nourishment, if you're going to build an island, if you're going to fill that 3 mile limit, it'll be Clean Water Act. If you're going to build a structure, if you're just dumping dredge material from a harbor, let's say the mud from Inner Plymouth Harbor, and you go offshore with the mud, and it's outside the 3 mile limit, it would be Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act. Even inside the 3 mile limit, if it's just disposal, they want to go under the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act. And I'll go through that in a minute. But most of the fill, and most of its beach nourishment, piling, structures, that would be considered under the Clean Water Act. And I threw in one more small section here, the section 319, the non-point source pollution. So anything you do along the coast, any project you do, you must consider non-point source pollution. And Mass Maritime had to consider for the parking lot C. When they did that, they had to consider 319. And under 319, the states get money, and we at Mass Maritime had get a nice chunk of money to monitor non-point source pollution, stormwater pollution. We're actually testing it. That's one of those internship programs. If you're interested, you can get involved with co-ops that we run out of here. So this authority under the Clean Water Act actually needs compliance by whatever you do along the coast, and it really is just trying to protect marine resources. So as I said, if it's out in the if you're dumping dredged material dredged for navigation in the ocean under the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, you must get a permit. Very clear. This is back in the 70s. Very clear permit. Now, EPA is in charge of any disposal in the ocean. So technically EPA is in charge with the permit, but also the Army Corps, given its knowledge of dredging and knowledge of structures in the ocean, is giving the permit action, the permit authority. They issue the permit. But EPA is in charge of the testing and has to concur with the permit. The Act, Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, besides ocean disposal, I mean, it establishes Stellwagen Bank Marine Sanctuary, the Farallands Marine Sanctuary in California, the Flower Garden Marine Sanctuary down in the Gulf of Mexico. So the Act has a lot of sections. I won't get into all of them in this class, but it does set up the structure for disposal of dredged material in the ocean. So to do that, it said, well, we can't just dump anything in the ocean. Right up to the 70s, we were dumping anything in the ocean. We dumped the lab coats in glassware from the Manhattan Project that they used in Harvard. We just dumped it in the ocean. So we put them in cement. We put them in barrels, filled it with cement, dumped them in the ocean. So we have a tendency, all the cellar dirt, all the busted up stuff from Boston, we said, barge, just dump it in the ocean. So by the 70s, we decided, yeah, we really got to get a handle on this. The thing we mostly dumped in the ocean, and New York was the biggest one, was waste from sewage treatment plants. So the solids eventually would be barged offshore, and there was this train of barges that constantly would go, filled with solids from wastewater treatment plant, and dump it. It was called the 102. The 102 dump site. It happened to be 102 feet deep, so they had this site, and to this day is just dead. It's a dead zone. It's just too much eutrophication there. So the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act gave EPA authority over anything that goes in the ocean, even fish waste. Gortons of Gloucester would have barges filled with fish carcasses. They fillet them to make fillet of fish, and that waste has to be dumped in the ocean. So they would have to get a permit to do that. An interesting side tag there is that's monitored by NOAA, National Marine Fisheries, because they said, maybe what we should do is dump that fish waste in areas where other fish, lobsters, would benefit. So it was managed for a while. I was on a research boat, and we had put down research gill nets. So what you have is a long gill net with floats. You set them overnight, and you have different size meshes to catch different size fish. And we came back the next day, and as we hauled up, it was filled with dead fish guts. It was the most disgusting thing ever. That's because the night before they happened to dump a load of gurry, they called it, of fish waste out of Gloucester right on the dredged material disposal site we were studying. So yeah, there's a lot of authorities out there. So EPA sets up some criteria to where do we put the ocean disposal sites, and I showed you that map, and they brought it down to just 1 or 2 per state, as opposed to 10 or 15 per harbor. That makes a lot of sense. And there's criteria by which you designate the site, and then there's criteria by which you analyze dredged material before it goes to the ocean. And then it authorized the Secretary of the Army, which means the Army Corps of Engineers. It's the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, which is the person in charge of the Army Corps of Engineers. They issue permits for dredged material disposal. Now the interesting thing is, see the 3 Mile Clean Water Act there, the territorial waters we talked about, that's 12 nautical miles offshore. And then there's a contiguous zone where you can't discharge waste. So then there's the exclusive economic zone. All right. And what if you went past that and into international waters? Couldn't you take dredged material and then dump it in the ocean? Could you take the contaminated dredge material from New Bedford Harbor and dump it out there? Geez, if you could do that, you wouldn't have to spend $600 million to remediate New Bedford Harbor PCBs. You just put them in a barge. That probably would have been done a long time ago. This law regulates the transport of the dredge material across federal waters also. And remember, federal waters includes the first 3 miles, so the 12 miles. So if you, territorial waters, when I say federal waters, it's territorial, usually it's interchangeable. If you transport the dredge material those 12 miles anywhere across there and say, I'm steaming out to the ocean, I'm going to get rid of this crazy contaminated stuff, you still have to get a permit from the Army Corps under EPA authority. So there is, if you're interested in the science, if you're interested in a research, if you're interested, there are big companies. Battel's one of them, AECOM. There's a couple around the country, but they hire people that just deal with going out and testing materials in harbors, bringing it back and doing bioassay, bioaccumulation tests. Now, it's very similar to our concept of bioaccumulation. Basically, they take mud from a harbor, and under the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, they have what's called a Regional Implementation Manual. It's a green book. It's got a green cover on it. They call it the Green Book. It tells you how to test and what species to use. And it's a lot of money, too. Our budget on Providence, I think I've told you, was $5.4 million. So you have to take animals and expose them to the mud and have 5 replicate tanks, 4 different species, controls, full of the earth, a real science experiment, and you allow the animals to live in contact with this dredge material for 28 days. And what dies that's called a bioassay. If it kills it, then you say, all right, maybe we shouldn't be dumping this anywhere in the ocean. And even if it doesn't die and everything that is exposed, they analyze the tissue content and see if it bioaccumulates somehow into their tissue. Because, sometimes, like I always say, animals, certainly worms and polychaetes, and they don't really mind PCBs and a lot of scary carcinogen type organics. They live fine in that. But if you're going to expose that to fish and then ultimately to humans, you really got to know you're doing that. So that's called bioassay bioaccumulation under the Green Book. There'll be a whole semester for anybody that wants to take it next fall of the Coastal Zone Management Act. I'll do this in a couple slides. The purpose of the Coastal Zone Management Act is slightly different than other coastal acts. Preserve, protect, restore, and enhance. That's good. The word develop is there. The Office of Coastal Resource Management is in NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is Department of Commerce. It's there because our marine fisheries was economically, through the centuries, one of our biggest commercial resources. NOAA, in particular, wanted to assure that we protect and preserve our coastal habitats, but we also want to develop our marine resources. And there is a direct correlation to dredging, ports, fishing, ports for our commercial marine resource harvesters to bring in their catch in, offload it, get it quickly to wherever it has to go. So there's a third, maybe 20% of people in the Office of Coastal Zone Management that just assists towns and municipalities in developing their port and coastal commerce. And that includes developing, offshore wind farms of support areas. A lot of what we do along the coast is part of our marine resource commerce. So when it says, the Coastal Zone Management Act, and again, I won't get into the whole semester's worth of work, but it is about having the ability to harvest the marine resources. Some definitions, I just want you to understand here that, coastal waters are Great Lakes. Coastal states include the Great Lakes. So NOAA is using the Coastal Zone Management Act since the 70s to take money and give it to the states. And they are telling the states to make special area management plans. So the state of Rhode Island made a special area management plan using this money for offshore wind farms. That's why we have the wind turbines off of Rhode Island. It was a coastal zone management initiative. Certainly sponsored. Their governor certainly endorsed that. So the act says the primary responsibility for the marine resources are at the state level, because where are you going to land the marine resources? Where's the power from wind turbines going to be? Where are you using the marine environment for pollution assimilation? Where do all the fisheries land? You have to have ports, you have to have facilities. Where's the navigation go? So they recognize that, and they give 50% of the money to staff a coastal zone management office. So 50% of the management program in every state is funded by the federal government. And for these special area management plans, they'll pay 100% sometimes. If there's an interest in the administration, and offshore energy, period, has been a large interest. So if any state wants to do a special area management plan for offshore energy, they could probably get 100% funding from the U.S. federal government. The other thing it does is that federal agencies, whether it's Navy, Coast Guard, Army Corps, BOEM, any federal agency must cooperate with the state governments to assure compliance with their coastal zone management plan. That's the federal sovereign immunity is waived again, just like on the Clean Water Act. Anything within 3 miles of the coast, you must get a coastal zone management consistency determination. So you got to get a permit from the state. They call this permit a coastal consistency determination. So if you want to get a permit from the Army Corps to put the pilings in for the floating piers at Mass Maritime, you have to give them documentation that federal action of issuing a permit to Mass Maritime is consistent with the Coastal Management Plan of Massachusetts. And in the Coastal Management Plan of Massachusetts, Taylor Point Campus, the pier and the floating dock area and the berth for Kennedy, is considered a port area. So building a structure for supporting navigation in a port area is consistent with the published Coastal Zone Management Plan. So you can see how it limits, or at least makes a little more, or at least steers developers along the coast to say, oh, I'm not going to build a new port, build a new structure, and I'll allow those coastal resources we want to preserve to be preserved, and I'll go develop whatever new structures I need in an existing port. And that's why the wind turbine support system is being developed in the Port of New Bedford. Although it's a good fishing fleet, and all the bananas, you know that all the bananas for New England come into New Bedford. That's one of their biggest trades. So the commercial port area has been, some of it's been abandoned. Some of it, they used to have factories right there. So now they're developing that to support the wind turbine. And that was a big special area management plan pushed from the Coastal Zone Management Program. I always say this, that's why the all of these activities, you usually do one document with, say you're a consulting firm and you wanted to get Mass Maritime's permits for our pilings. Well, in that, I've already said coastal zone management compliance, water quality certificate, essential fish habitat. All those compliances usually go into one document, the DEPA document. And that way you have one document everyone's using for all these different marine resource management compliances. NEPA document, usually environmental impact statement or environmental assessment. This law in particular, a lot of laws have a time frame that if you ask for a coastal zone consistency determination, you have 45 days and you will get it. NOAA has a requirement the state answers you in 45 days. If not, you can ask, they can ask for a 15-day extension. But all of these acts put time limits on that. So again, you have to look at an agency that has these time limits. They have to have a staff. Their staff has to be maintained at a pretty high level. And you folks could easily get employment doing this, working for them, reviewing and deciding whether or not these projects are consistent with the coastal zone management plans. If it's not consistent, and let's say that New Bedford Harbor wanted to expand a part of the port into a wetlands area because they wanted to expand it for wind turbines, and coastal zone management says no, then the elevation is at the Secretary of Commerce level. And that's funny because Secretary of Commerce now has to balance port development versus, coastal coastal resource conservation. So it does kind of lean towards commerce, but you don't want to go to Washington and have some cabinet level people, EPA cabinet, or these, undersecretary of NOAA for fisheries arguing. Yeah, you don't want to do all that. They usually try to work it all out in the field. So if you work for a consulting firm, you'd be at some meeting and this flow chart would come up and they say, all right, where are we? What do we have to do? You won't be tested on this, but if you're going to go get interviewed by a consulting firm someday or an agency, just go back and think of these flow charts because this is the yes or no or how do you apply for the permits. This is a quick, easy act, but I want you to understand, you always hear this with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and you always think about the Yukon and wild and scenic rivers. But this act comes into play in coastal watersheds in the Northeast here in New England several times. And certainly in we were talking about the issues of salmon under the Endangered Species Act. Well, there's also issues of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in these watersheds and what you're allowed to do. And sometimes restoration and improving things for salmon conflicts with an act like this. Other times an act like this can really protect the environment when there's nothing else. It's a quick little, I just wanted to bring out 1 or 2 points on this one. Everyone thinks it's all about wild rivers, but there's also scenic rivers. And a scenic river can, or shorelines and watersheds can have roads on them because how would you access it if it wasn't scenic? And then there's recreational river areas also. And we have a few of them, and then kayaking and boat launching, and so it's not all wild rivers, primitive, free flowing. This gives agencies a lot of different authority. I guess it kind of picked up some loopholes about people changing the watershed along, and especially coastal watersheds, and especially areas where you have anadromous fish. There's 12,000 miles of wild and scenic rivers. Again, it's classified as wild river or scenic river or recreational rivers. So it doesn't necessarily, it's not down east, down backwoods Maine. And compliance is actually relatively easy. It's managed by just about every federal agency there is, but the National Park Service is in charge. And anytime there's an Army Corps permit, okay, so we know anything we do along the coast needs an Army Corps permit, you have to tell them you are in compliance with this. And the first thing you do is the National Park Service has maps. It's very simple. If you were wondering if you go to your favorite river or you're kayaking somewhere, you could actually jump right onto the National Park Service Wild and Scenic River mapping, and you can determine whether or not you're in a federally designated area for wild and scenic rivers. And if something you're going to do is going to change it from wild or change it from scenic to not scenic, and that's the one they've been using as a hook a lot lately. Even though it, maybe you want to put in a fish passage, maybe you want to do a big fish hatchery. Well, and you'd like to do that in the wild area of Maine for Atlantic salmon, and this has been an issue. They wanted a major fish hatching, and they said, no, this is a wild river, and it'll no longer be wild, there'll be this big hatchery, so they had to modify what they were doing. And what they're doing was great. They're trying to restore salmon, but it would violate the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. This is the easiest part about this is if you go on the map and it's not there, you don't have to do anything. If you are doing some work in a segment of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, you have to do a write-up of the compliance and put it out in the NEPA document. So pretty straightforward, but it's an act you should be familiar with. Here's the flow chart. If you're a consultant, say, wait a minute, what do we have to do for this? The Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act is the most difficult act. Easily you could get a 40-hour training on this, easily a whole semester on just the Clean Air Act. We know how important the Clean Air Act is. We saw how there was cancer clusters near ports because of sulfur dioxide emissions. We know we're spending millions, literally millions, on complying with clean diesel emissions starting January 1st, 2020. So the Clean Air Act works, and it wasn't even invoked till 1970. And every decade, EPA has kind of ratcheted down, and they know that. They could not have come in 1970 and said, ships, stop it. No sulfur, zero sulfur dioxide emissions. Forget it. You would close down the industry. You would close down society. So every decade, and that's why in the 90s and the turn of the century and the 2010s, they said okay, now 2020, your sulfur emissions have to be down this low for ships. It's all under the Clean Air Act. And it's all a system of ratcheting down. Notice on this, it says the purpose is to protect the health and welfare of society by the control of pollution. You'll see that in the Clean Water Act, health and welfare. Basically, health and welfare means there's usually two different standards of compliance. The health of us and the welfare. The health would be if you're exposed to carbon monoxide at a certain level, you die. So acute exposure. Welfare is the long-term exposure. So it's usually a lot lower, but if you were exposed to carbon monoxide every day for 8 hours a day at work, over time, you could develop problems. Or just think of any of the air pollutants. Some things kill you immediately. Some things give you cancer over the long term. Sulfur dioxide is one of them too. So health and welfare, and you'll see there's usually two standards. These are the critical air pollutants. Interestingly enough, they're very much managed for greenhouse gases too, aren't they? So NOx, nitrous oxide. So you see the OX, the easiest one, H2O could be H2X because there is, so X, the X stands for some combination of atoms in the molecule. I'm just going to try to walk away from the chemistry. I do like chemistry, so I tend to delve in it. PM is particulate matter. There's 10 microns and 2.5 microns. So a micron is a thousandth of a millimeter. So 2.5 microns is what will get deep into your lungs. 10 microns would be dust. 10 microns is chalk dust. You would see it in the air. The 2.5 micron stuff, so 10 microns and 2.5 even sulfur soot is about that too. So that's just particulate matter. It's just they talk about size of particles, and it could be chalk dust, it could be sulfur dioxide with carbon, and I guess you're familiar with the rest of these pollutants. In order to comply with the Clean Air Act, there's a lot of different testing. And you see here, and don't worry about this table at all, just I want you to know that there's pollutants named, and then there are standards. And there's a primary standard and a secondary standard with all kinds of testing, 8-hour average, 1 hour, 24-hour. And there's back to that concept of health and welfare. What is acutely toxic and what is toxic when we expose a community over time, and especially a port, which you know ships are coming in and out and so many ships a day. Over time, you get that chronic toxicity. Acutely toxic, well, okay, maybe the air quality is not good, but no one's going to die from immediate exposure of sulfur dioxide. Or when the Kennedy starts up, no one's going to die. Over time, you have those chronic exposures. So I just a little quick overview of how do you come into compliance with the Clean Air Act. There are lots of parts of the country that are already determined as non-attainment. They're not in compliance, or they were out of compliance and now they're trying to be maintained healthy. So when that happens, the Clean Air Act kicks in and gets pretty stringent. And it all has to do with complying with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And in general, it's called general conformity. In general, every federal, state, and local activity has to comply with the Clean Air Act. There are maps of this. This is the 1997 ozone standards. It hasn't been changed since 97. You may remember around 2007 to 2010, there were these large arguments of trying to change, sort of ratchet down some of the Clean Air Act standards. It never got done. Industry sometimes says this is a multi-billion-dollar impact. You can't do this. Sometimes the focus is from ozone to greenhouse gases to global climate change. So it really is through time you'll see the standards change. So the 8-hour ozone standard is still non-compliance, non-attainment for a lot of parts of the nation. Those green areas were population centers that used to not be in compliance, and that's just all that is simply due to the catalytic converters. They did catalytic converters, and they realized that the ozone in some of these, not super developed industrial areas, or I shouldn't even say industrial because it really is just the mega cities and cars. California has an inversion layer, so California is tough to begin with. But there are so many automobiles, so much emissions that the ozone standards in our area is still hard to comply with. But catalytic converters made a difference. So, and the mapping is extensive. So, but if you look around the country, and this is each color, so if it's a green, it means one standard is in non-attainment. And for the most part, that's ozone from the map I just showed you. But there are other areas in Southern California in particular, around the Great Lakes, some of the industrial areas, where there's 2, 3, or even 4 standards, 4 pollutants that are in non-attainment. So EPA is pretty good about looking at this and also looking downwind too. This is really tough. I mean, Clean Air Act, and I always say this, hire a consultant. Or if you're really interested in air chemistry, meteorology, and magic, because I do think there's smoke mirrors magic, air chemistry and weather. And that's how you determine if an area or an action is going to be in compliance. But they have federal money under the Clean Air Act goes to states, and the states have what they call a state implementation plan, a SIP. So the National Ambient Air Quality Standards must be managed by the state. And think of it as a bubble, and usually it's under whatever particular urban or industrial area of the state. They do a state implementation plan, and we're probably we are in the we're in the Cape right to Boston. That whole bubble, they kind of make it a little bit big, trying to get the cleaner areas in too. But EPA must approve a state implementation plan, and that just balances how much emissions you're going to allow. And in areas of non-attainment, like ozone for us, they are asking the states to balance or recognize, any change in development, any transportation changes. You may be bringing more ozone when they're trying to get us to get in attainment with ozone. But it doesn't turn its back on the sulfur dioxides, the port emissions. So EPA, and this is another one, federal sovereign immunity is waived. The federal agencies must conform. So if you're Navy, you must conform. If you're going to, New London sub base, Navy base, Air Force puts out a lot of emissions. Certainly the Army Corps, we always had to conform with the Clean Air Act. Usually, unless you're building power plants, you really don't have a major issue. Steel plants out in the Midwest certainly do. So there's general conformity. Anything you do, so ports are in general conformity, except if they're transits like ferries. So port shipping is general conformity, but there's something called transportation conformity, and that's roads. And it's recognized that ferries and roads and people, you have to do that. So it's recognized that federal highways is actually allowed a little more pollution, I guess is the way to say it, than all the rest in general conformity, even though shipping seems to be transportation to me, but I didn't write that act. So how do you do it? So basically you have to ensure whatever federal action meets the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So if you're going to issue a permit, if you're going to dredge a harbor, you're going to build something, it has to comply with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So our federal funds in maintaining ports must comply. And I'm getting into details so you can kind of just sit back and let me, you really want to know that there's a state implementation plan for the Clean Air Act, and there are national ambient air quality standards. But to comply, and I'll just walk you through, you have to do an emission analysis. There's a little bit of calculations. And there's direct emissions and indirect. There's direct emissions during construction. And indirect over time. So the Port of Boston during construction realized that all the big dredges were going to violate the Clean Air Act. So the Port of Boston is dredging for 6 months and then stopping because the state implementation plan is an average annual input to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards levels. So how many tons of sulfur dioxide? How many tons in the air? And that's a lot. I mean, you're measuring parts per million. So the National Ambient Air Quality Standard told the Port of Boston and the federal government, the Army Corps of Engineers, my old crew, that in order to comply with the Clean Air Act, you can only dredge 6 months of the year. Then you have to demob, and they demob, and they take those dredges elsewhere. Well, that demobilization costs you $3 million a year. But in order to comply with the Clean Air Act, you just can't go and go and go. Then that's a $300 million project, and it's pretty significant. So that's the direct. Then the indirect calculations had to be okay, how much more shipping is going to occur? The good thing about deepening Boston Harbor is the newer ships that came through the Panama Canal, the post-Panamax, are a little bit lower in diesel emissions. They're not as low as some of them have scrubbers. But the good thing about it is if you bring in one ship with a lot more goods, it's less trips per goods. Therefore, theoretically, you have less emissions. Um, that being said, they're still kicking up sulfur dioxide like crazy. But bigger, deeper ships mean less ships, so that's how they do that calculations. But what if it was kind of a surprise to everybody that, we're going to dredge Boston Harbor, but we're exceeding the emissions. Well, there are emission standards. Again, you're not being tested on any of this. For sulfur dioxide, look down there in all non-attainment and maintenance areas. So all those, that first slide I showed you, you can only put out 100 tons per year. So now you'll have to look at, well, I don't know if we're going to do pile driving or jetting to put those pilings in at Taylor Point for Mass Maritime. How much tons? It was probably, 0.000 tons or something. So you have to measure what the emissions are and then put it against a table like this. And this is the federal table, National Ambient Air Quality Standards. But then you have to go look at the state implementation plan. So the state plan is going to be more stringent. You have to do that. You have to you have to prepare a statement of conformity. Does your project conform with the state implementation plan? I guess it's called a SOC. I think you remember the NACs. If you analyze the NACs, you have to use your SOC to determine your conformity with the SIP. So, if you ever want to remember that, and I don't think you should. So, just like any of these laws and regulations, it has to go out for a 30-day public notice. And that's why I keep talking about a National Environmental Policy Act, Environmental Impact Statement, Environmental Assessment. So there's another one of those acts. Beside the Marine Mammal Protection Act, you have to put out to the public, how does your project comply with the Clean Air Act? So any one of these marine resource development projects, we'll have a good couple 100-page volume document to back up all the analysis and all this environmental compliance. So more terminology, you either conform by doing an analysis, or your project is so small that it's not applicable to Clean Water Act Statement of Conformity. So these are the two documents you might see. You're going to see one in the Cape Cod Canal bridges. They are going to probably do a statement of conformity, and I think they're also saying that there'll be a record of non-applicability for the construction. I'm surprised at that, but again, if you want to do this as a living, if you're interested in air quality, meteorology, there is a need. This is a job you could get at any time. There's not a lot of people that go into this. And if you get a couple years experience, let's say you work for the state, they always go right out to a consulting firm and you get paid big bucks to know how to comply with acts like this. So what I want you to know about this, again, federal sovereign immunity is waived, whether it's Navy, Coast Guard, or Army Corps dredge in Boston. You must comply with the Clean Water Act, and there is something called the State Implementation Plan and a National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And finally, just about done. I'd hang on, we're almost out of this lecture series. There's a Farmland Protection Policy Act, and the only reason I bring it up is because in the next couple of years you're going to see that. And it basically, it doesn't want, it's an act that says agricultural land should be preserved as agricultural land. And instead of changing your farmland to condos, developments, residential areas, this act came out and said, no, no, no. If it's, farmland, especially in the Northeast, especially in certain parts of the Southeast, uh, farmland is at a premium. And you want to nowadays we say shop locally. Well, we don't have a lot of farmland left in New England, so anything has got to be trucked in. But now what's happening is the cranberry bogs around us here at Mass Maritime, they're looking at converting the cranberry bogs, because actually Wisconsin, is it? Yeah, I think it's Wisconsin or Michigan. There's more cranberry production elsewhere. They need cool water, lots of land. So now we're converting cranberry bogs back into wetlands. That's what the funny part is. We're trying to do some cranberry bog restoration, because originally the cranberry bogs were wetlands, and we just came in, and they usually would dig the wetlands out and put nice clean sand on the bottom and plant the cranberries in sand. So as well, you still have the hydrology, so maybe we could just get them back to wetlands. And the Farmland Protection Act says, no, you can't do that, because cranberry bogs in Massachusetts, cranberry farmland is at a premium. So you're going to see some of that in the next couple of years. One is right at the head of Red Brook watershed, and it just always amuses me when a act to protect something won't allow you to restore something. Simple enough. There's a Form AD 1006. All you got to do is fill out a form. You go online. If you have farmlands that are on the Natural Resource Conservation Service listing, then you just go in and fill this form out. You send it to them, and they'll either say, yep, you're all set, or no, we got to talk about it. So that was a lot. That was a lot of environmental compliance. That was a lot to do in one session. These type of compliances, though, by going through this, you are qualified to work at most state and federal agencies and get a job and say, yes, I have some familiarity with environmental laws and regulations. As I told you, I teach 2 or 3 times a year. I teach these laws in expanded form, but I teach them to all the new Army Corps of Engineers employees, and EPA has instructors that teach all the EPA employees. This is what federal and state agencies do. They train people in these laws. This is what consulting firms dream of, is having somebody qualified coming out of college with some basic skills in environmental compliances like this, because it's not one law, and that's the takeaway point. Anything you do in marine resources, anything you do in developing marine resources, there are a lot of laws and they all interact. These are the highlights in Clean Water Act, Marine Protection. I gave you the acronyms. Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is that WNSRA. Basically, 401 of the Clean Water Act is the State Water Quality Certificate. The Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, you must get compliance for ocean disposal of dredged material. That's the Green Book. You do testing by the Green Book. To be compliant with the Coastal Zone Management Act, you have to prepare a coastal consistency determination, and you have to look at the state management plans and say, is my action, is my port development consistent with the state management plan? Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, kind of an easy one, just are you on the map or not? Clean Air Act, you do a statement of conformity of your action. Does it conform, does it comply with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for the State Implementation Plan, the SIP, in areas that are in non-attainment? Obviously, and if you're in parts of the country, maybe I didn't enter the rest of the map, you really don't have to worry about Clean Air Act because they're already in compliance. And then the Farmland Protection and Policy Act is, well, if you're going to convert those cranberry bogs, we might have a little bit of a problem. And then finally, just a note, remember the Clean Water Act requires a public review, as in all of these acts. Usually you put it in the NEPA document, And under the Clean Water Act, the federal permit is under Section 404. But the state permit under Section 401 is called a water quality certificate.